Hi everyone, and welcome to From the Trenches. This is an informal interview with coaches and athletes who are using monitoring in different forms. And to kick this section off, I thought I'd start with a couple of examples of some of my own work that I've done with athletes in the past. And the first one is from Bath Rugby. They are a rugby union team in the United Kingdom in the professional Premier League over there. And this actually formed my PhD. But it was a really applied project. And because I've been working with them for quite some time, I had the level of trust and the relationships with the players to be able to do this level of a project. The project revolved around looking at markers of salivary testosterone and cortisol, which is something that we covered in the module learning. So hence we thought it was really relevant. And really what we wanted to do is to get an idea of the fluctuations of salivary testosterone and cortisol around training and competition. And what we did, we started off with some pilot work the year before, found some really interesting relationships around responses to training sessions and also to what happened around game day. Then we followed it into the second year, which we did it over another 6-week period, and we pretty much found the same result. And I just want to briefly go through it with you. Now, when we did this work, all these athlete management systems that we see today weren't really around. Everything was done on Excel spreadsheets. There was no automated apps that you could put on your phone. And we didn't have the level of wearable technologies that we also have today. So the ability to get heart rate variability through using devices such as a Whoop wasn't available to us. GPS, they were in its infancy in terms of a product that the athletes would wear. Today, we had 5 GPS units, which was new and quite innovative at the time at this club. So this was going back 2004, 2005, up to 2010. So at 2010, clubs started to use GPS units for monitoring running load during training, but we weren't allowed to use them during a game. Now, as everyone would be aware, you can wear them during the game. Anyway, from this project, we're able to get some really cool insights into the effects that training and competition have on the body using salivary testosterone and cortisol. Now, if we look at the midweek markers, we had what we call a midweek stress test. Now, this could be anything as long as it's physical and has a level of intensity. For us, it was our major skill session for the week. There's some studies which has a sprint test, a certain number of sprints over a certain distance. And there's another study as well that uses a gym session midweek. And they've actually, like ours, we found that the response that we have to that high intensity session correlates or relates to the outcome on the weekend. With respect to the midweek skill session, we're going to talk about specifically the testosterone to cortisol ratio. And if you remember, that's that anabolic to catabolic ratio. So for us, if we had lower pre-training testosterone to cortisol ratio levels before our midweek skill session, we would have a win on the weekend. But more importantly, if we had a greater rise from pre to post session, that would relate to a win on the weekend, which is telling us that we had an anabolic or a positive response to that stress stimulus, which is telling us it set us up nicely for the upcoming weekend. Then if we look at game day monitoring, our pre-game testosterone concentrations as a group, if they were higher, we would win. Now that makes sense because testosterone not only correlates with strength, speed, and power, but it also relates to positive behavior such as determination, aggression, and willingness to work harder. In some studies, it's increased testosterone concentrations has been shown to correlate with increase in training loads. And being an aggressive-based sport, high levels of testosterone, we would feel would be more favorable in a sport like rugby union. However, anyway, we see this midweek stress test. We have a positive response. If we had a positive response, that would relate to a higher pre-game testosterone concentration. So that session is somehow setting us up hormonally really well for that weekend. Now, if we had higher levels of pre-game testosterone, we are more likely to win than lose. Now, there's many other factors that go into the game, such as home and away. If you're at home, you tend to have higher pre-game testosterone concentrations, but that didn't really affect us. And what I thought there is that potentially because we were a professional team and we were very experienced at the time, that these little things didn't really faze the players. Now, for a moment, if we actually look at the game and we look at the data, because we want to be looking at other monitoring tools as well. So what can you be monitoring during a game? Now, at the time, we didn't have GPS data. So if we did, we could have been looking at hormonal concentrations and what was happening with the GPS data. Did it correlate with higher speeds reached and so forth? But what we did have available to us was KPIs. And these were derived from actions that the players did during the game. Now, the statistician already had this, and he had two types of KPIs. One was a skill-based KPI, and that would be as simple as effective passes and so forth, or positive kicks. And then we would have an aggressive-based KPI, and that would be related more to those tackles and the actions in the game that are more aggressive-based. And interestingly, we also found that the high levels of testosterone concentrations related to our aggressive-based KPI, and the higher our aggressive-based KPI, we would win. So that really nice relationship there. Which then brings us to the next question saying, well, what would happen if midweek, if we could get this level of analysis real time? Now, at the time, what the players would do, they would drill saliva into a tube, we would freeze it, and then we would send it off for batch analysis. So unfortunately, we didn't have this real time. But the question we would then ask is saying, well, if we didn't have a nice positive response to that stress test, what could we do in between the midweek stress test and the game to potentially help elevate our pre-game testosterone concentrations? And if you remember in the reading in the chapter, it's been worked with some other applied sports scientists looking at the hormonal response to strength training sessions. And the outcome of that is it's really individualized. And the positive on-shoot from that is that if we do a strength training session that gives us a maximal testosterone increase from pre to post, and we train using that type of protocol, we are more likely to increase our strength and muscle hypertrophy. So say, for example, you take a 3x5 at 85% of RM and a 3x15 at 55% of 1 RM. And our 3x5 gives us a T max, and our 15 rep protocol doesn't give us much change, what we call a T min protocol. We want to be training our T max, because our T min, that's not going to give us the changes that we want, especially in this athlete cohort. And therefore, the next phase of this, which was our fourth study, was where we looked at 4 different exercise training protocols, and a slightly different spin on some of the other sports science researchers have done, in that the first 2 training sessions were strength-based inspired. It was a 5x15 at 55% of that 1 RM, high repetitions, nice and quick, and then a 3x5 at 85% of 1 RM, using high pull squat, chin-ups, or a row, and a bench press. So these exercises are what most rugby union players and most athletes would do. So really realistic for this athlete cohort. The other 2 sessions with slightly different change was a strongman session, and they involved exercises such as battling ropes, prowler pushes, farmer's walks, and tire flips, and then boxing and a wrestling inspired session. We call that a combative session. And the rugby union players really love doing a strongman session, and they love doing boxing and wrestling. And sometimes in season, when you have short turnarounds or you need top-ups, having these slightly different variations in training programs that you can give to the athletes makes the training really refreshing. So a long season, which is quite grindy in the UK, it becomes quite dark and wet and cold. So you might say, right, this week, we're just going to do a strongman session. The boys rip in, they're done and dusted within 30 minutes. And therefore that the enjoyment factor is really high with that as well. And they get to work together as a team. And that's something we can't neglect, is the individual athletes versus team sport athletes. How can you create environments to improve the training outcome. And in this case, we're looking at hormonal responses to training sessions. Now, when we just grouped the data, when you put all the data together for each individual session, we saw no clear advantage of one training methodology over the other. But when we retrospectively grouped the data according to T-max protocols, like in the other studies that were in the readings, that we actually saw significant increases in testosterone for 5x15 at 55%, the strongman, and also the boxing wrestling session. Therefore, from that, how could we use this knowledge, even if we don't have real-time analysis? Well, what we could do is that, knowing the data, is that when we have a short turnaround or the players are feeling a little bit flat, we actually put this protocol into play for these athletes, knowing that at the end of the day, that it's the performance on the weekend that really counts. So we want to be optimizing that. So that's how we were using our monitoring with salivary hormonal markers to actually set things up for our players. And that's how I used it with Bath. Now, some other little bits of information which didn't make it into the thesis, but one thing that we thought about is that could we find something that correlates really well with hormonal markers? And in this case, we looked at jump data, vertical jump data on a force plate. And that was one of our very first concepts that we spoke about in the chapter, was neuromuscular fatigue. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be great if we could see a nice correlation between our jump data, one of the variables that we get on a force plate, and our salivary hormones. Now, the outcome is we didn't find anything of significance. And part of the reason that I potentially thought that we didn't is vertical jumping relevant to rugby union players? For a handful of players, such as the backs, who are quite fast and explosive, jumping might be relevant. But for the forwards, we have guys anywhere between 120 to 130 kilos. They're pretty beat up from the game. So the ability for them to jump maximally for you to get a true reflection is quite difficult in season, week in, week out. However, we didn't find a relationship. So for us, is that test really relevant? And I don't think it was in this case. Anyway, that's how we used salivary hormones in an applied sports setting, and how we could potentially use that ongoing when we get to the stage where this kind of data is available to us real time. And the second example is with an athlete at the time that I was working with. He was an elite athlete, a discus thrower, Australian record holder, and multiple Olympian. And therefore, he was right at the top of his game. And we would look at 3 different measures when he came into the gym to see if there was some kind of relationship between each other. And the 3 measures were, the first one was subjective. How are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 5? 1, not great. 5, he is ready to go hard in the gym and he's feeling primed. The other one was a vertical jump measure, where we'd be looking at flight time over contraction time. We saw in our readings that flight time over contraction time is deemed to be potentially a bit more of a sensitive measure than vertical jump height. And also velocity on the barbell. His first lift for this session would be a high pull, and he would do a warm-up and actually have a little bit of load on the bar. And then we would go down and incrementally increase the load. Now, at the time, this thrower was high pulling 160 plus kilos. So we'd start with 60, 80, 100, 120, 140. That's a systematic warm-up. We make sure he's ready to go for his heavier sets, but also with maximal intent, we're monitoring barbell velocity, and we're able to get a profile. And we have historical data, we can actually see how he's comparing to other days. So if he's hitting on the top side of all these velocities, potentially neuromuscularly, he's in great shape. We did this for a few weeks, and the results were not conclusive. There was no clear relationship. And in fact, the jump data didn't really correlate well to the subjective and the velocity. And we didn't do any scientific analysis with this data, but there was a feeling that the subjective and the velocity data had slightly more of a relationship. But the jump data, the flight time over contraction time, if we use that to solely drive our training for the day, he wouldn't have trained. So what I'm saying there was, as he came in, flight time over contraction time was low, which we would think that he's not in great shape, but that didn't correlate with his velocity data with the barbell. What this is saying is that you need to take multiple monitoring data points from different measures to truly get that better picture. And in my experiences as a coach, nothing beats a conversation with the athletes or the athlete that you're working with to truly understand where they're at. If they're filling in an AMS system and they're flagging something or the jump data's low, a conversation as opposed to seeing the number and then excluding it from different sessions has far more value, because it could be as simple as motivation. They've just had a bad sleep, but they're feeling great. They've had an argument on the way. Someone's cut them off in the car. There's all these different reasons, and it's multifaceted. So it's very hard to stick onto one monitoring measure only. It's that whole picture which is really important. That's a couple of stories from some of my experiences as my time as an S&C coach. And as always, it's important to talk to athletes to find out what's working for them and what they think that truly helps them. Thanks for listening.